unreeled. Vintage recordings of fiction recovered from discontinued physical media.
Tottie by Rumer Godden. This is a novel written about dolls in a doll's house. The chief person in it is Tottie Plantagenet, a small Dutch doll. Dutch dolls are scarce now, but Tottie was made a long time ago when they were plentiful and sold in every shop that had toys for sale. The large ones cost a penny, the middle-sized a halfpenny, and very small ones like Tottie were sold for a farthing each. At present, she lived in the nursery of two little girls called Emily and Charlotte Dane. I say at present because Tottie had lived a long while. Once she had lived with two other little girls, who were Emily and Charlotte's great-grandmother and their great-great-aunt Laura. Tottie was made of wood, and it was good wood. She liked to think sometimes of the tree of whose wood she was made, of its strength, and of the sap that ran through it and made it bud and put out leaves every spring and summer, that kept it standing through the winter storms and wind. A very little of that tree is in me, said Tottie. I am a little of that tree. She liked to think of it. She had glossy pink cheeks, and her eyes were painted with bright, firm paint, blue and very determined. Emily and Charlotte had chosen two other dolls to be Tottie's father and mother. Their names were Mr. Plantagenet and Mrs. Plantagenet, but Mrs. Plantagenet had another name, and that was Birdie. Of course, Tottie knew, just as you and I know, that Mr. and Mrs. Plantagenet were not her real father and mother, that she had no real father and mother, unless it were that felled tree of whose wood she was made. She knew that, just as she knew that her little brother Apple, the doll they had given her for a little brother, was made from plush, which is a kind of velvet, and Darner, the doll's house dog, had a backbone made from a darning needle. Listen to the story of Mr. Plantagenet, before he was Mr. Plantagenet. For a long while he was hurt and abused and lost. He was a delicate little doll, rather larger than Tottie, with a china face and brown glass eyes and real brown hair. He was a boy doll, and he always said he remembered once being dressed in a kilt as a Highlander, with toy bagpipes stuck to his hand, with hard, painful glue, painful when you tried to get it off. He was bought for some children, not, I am glad to say, Emily and Charlotte, quite other children, who took no care of him at all. It was they who dragged the bagpipes off and took some of the painted skin off the palm of his hand as well, and tore his clothes off too, and let their puppy bite his foot until it looked half nibbled. One of the boys drew a moustache on his little top lip with indelible pencil. Then they threw him into the cold, dark toy cupboard, where he lay for weeks and months, and might have lain for years if they had not been ordered to tidy the toy cupboard, because children were coming to tea. As it was, they left him lying on the floor under the table, and Emily, who was one of the visitors, nearly trod on him. "Oh, I am sorry," cried Emily, but nobody seemed to think it mattered. "What a dear little doll," said Emily, picking him up. The children said Emily could have him, and she wrapped him up in her handkerchief and took him home. She and Charlotte sponged the dust and glue off him with hot water and dried him carefully, and though the moustache would not come off, they knitted him a sock for his spoilt foot and put plaster on the palm of his hurt hand. And their mother made him a check flannel suit and a blue shirt and a tie of red silk ribbon. Emily cut him tiny newspapers out of the real ones to read. Mrs. Plantagenet was not quite right in the head. There was something in her head that rattled. Charlotte thought it might be beads, and it was true that the something made a gay sound like bright beads touching together. She was altogether gay and light, being made of cheap celluloid, but all the same nicely moulded and joined and painted. She came to Charlotte on a cracker at a party. Emily made Mrs. Plantagenet a red skirt with blue rick-rack braid on the hem, a blue blouse with red spots. The spots were pin spots, but they looked as large as buttons to Mrs. Plantagenet. As for Apple, there were no fears for him. Come fog, come fine, no one could be unkind to Apple. He was as big as Emily's thumb, plump and made of warm plush-coloured pink-brown. He felt nice, and he was nice, with chunky little arms and legs and sewn-in dimples and a wig of brown darning wool hair. Apple wore a buster suit, scarlet felt trousers and a white cambric blouse, white socks and red felt shoes that were fastened with the smallest of small pearl buttons you can imagine. No one ever saw Apple without exclaiming, "What a little love of a doll!" You had to be very careful how you touched Dana, because he had a prick at his head end. It was his darning needle backbone, and it made him difficult to handle. The rest of him was clipped wool, gone a little grey with London grime, over pipe-cleaner legs. Emily and Charlotte used to take him, in his turn, as they took the rest of the family to the park, so that he could bristle at other and real-sized dogs. He also liked staying at home. That was the trouble. There was no home. The shortage of dolls' houses was acute. There were a few in the toy shops, but they were very expensive and made of cheap papier-mâché or plywood. More than anything in the world, Mr. Plantagenet wanted a home. "One that will shut, one that will last. Do you think they will ever buy a house for us?" he asked. Of course there were dolls' houses advertised in the newspaper, but even the plain dolls' houses, 4 rooms, 2 rooms, some furniture, were 7 or 8 or 3 or even 4 guineas each, and neither Emily and Charlotte nor their father had that much money to spare. "We shall never get one," said Mr. Plantagenet. At the moment, the Plantagenets were as uncomfortable as anyone in London. They had to live crowded together in 2 shoeboxes that were cramped and cold and that could not shut. "Long, long ago," began Tottie in her comforting voice, and it is the best wood that gives out the most comforting voice. Ask the men who make pianos and violins and flutes. "Long, long ago, I knew a doll's house. I lived in it. It belonged to Laura. She was Emily and Charlotte's great-great-aunt. That was 100 years ago," said Tottie. Tottie had stayed the same all that time, for all that 100 years. Does that surprise you? "I was telling you about the doll's house," said Tottie. It was not too big. It could stand comfortably on the table, and outside it was a glossy cream colour painted with ivy. It looked as good as real ivy, said Tottie. "Go on, go on!" cried Apple. Emily had put him up on a chair, but he had deliberately fallen off upside down because he wanted to practice standing on his head. "Don't do that, Apple dear," said Tottie. "The doll's house?" "Oh, yes. In the front there was a front door with steps leading up to it." "How many steps?" "6, said Tottie. "And the door was painted green with a knocker. It didn't really open, but that didn't matter because the whole of the front swung open, leaving the inside ready to be played with. There was a kennel," she said, "just outside. There was a hall with a staircase and a polished wooden floor. The walls of the hall were red paper," she said, "that looked like satin. There was a hall window with lace curtains. The white looked pretty on the red. There were Christmas scraps for pictures, and a clock glued on the wall, and 2 doll's house dark wood chairs, and a tiny rug." "Everything," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Everything. And in the hall," said Tottie, "was the figure of a butler." "To the left was the kitchen," Tottie went on. "What was it like?" "What was it like? What was it like?" "There was a blue tin stove with saucepans and a kettle. There was a heavy iron on a stand, no bigger than Emily's fingernail. There was a rolling pin and a wooden pudding basin smaller than a thimble. There was a dresser with flowered china cups and plates on it, a table and another rug and kitchen chairs and a mangle and a pot of pretending geraniums on the window-sill." Up to now, the thought of the house and the thought of her hat had been knocking together in Birdie's head. Now she asked, "Was there a little feather broom?" "I think there was," said Tottie. To the right of the hall, said Tottie, was a sitting-room. It had a green carpet, said Tottie, the colour of holly leaves, and it had real wallpaper like the hall, only this one was white with cream stripes. On the wallpaper were 2 little pictures. Their frames were made of glued-on shells that Laura had picked up at the seaside. There was another window. "Did it open?" "No, it didn't open, but it had lace curtains too. And there was a fireplace and a fire of shining red gelatine paper. There was a sofa covered in red velvet, and 2 chairs to match, and a table and a piano. Its notes were paper notes glued on. On the table, said Tottie slowly, was a lamp with white china shade. It would really light if you used a birthday cake candle. "We should have to be careful of Apple with that candle," said Birdie suddenly, and they all stared at her, because that was such an unusually clear thing for Birdie to say. "You are right to be afraid of fire," said Tottie. "You are celluloid, Birdie, and that would flare up in an instant if you went anywhere near fire." "You would, you know," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Better not go near the candle, Birdie." "I?" asked Birdie, surprised. "I was thinking of Apple." "Also on the table," said Tottie, "there was a vase of wax roses. They were modelled in wax, and they were no bigger than a thimble. And in the sitting room there was a golden cage, and inside the cage was a bird." "A bird?" asked Birdie. "Did it sing?" "No, it couldn't sing," said Tottie, "but it was there." "Upstairs," said Tottie, "there were 2 bedrooms. One had pink flannel carpet, and one had a blue. There were beds with nicked round blankets, and there was a white tin bath with taps, and there was a cot with bars." "Would it do for me?" asked Apple. "It would be a good fit," said Tottie gravely. "Occupied, of course," said Mr. Plantagenet suddenly. "Occupied?" asked Tottie. "I mean, there are other dolls living in it, of course." "It was a long time ago," said Tottie. "Maybe it has gone, been sold or broken up. I don't know where it is now," said Tottie sadly. "That's Laura, great-great-aunt Laura, had a little girl. But the little girl is a great-aunt herself now. Why, she is Emily and Charlotte's great-aunt. Maybe she has given it away or given it up. I don't know." "But dolls lived in it then," said Mr. Plantagenet. "You lived in it once. Did other dolls live there with you? Don't you remember them?" "I remember one," said Tottie slowly. "Yes, I remember her," said Tottie very, very slowly. "Why do you say it like that? What was her name?" "Her name was Marchpane." "What a funny name! What does it mean?" "Marchpane is a heavy, sweet, sticky stuff like almond icing, very old-fashioned," said Tottie. "You very quickly have enough of it. It was a good name for her," said Tottie slowly. "But what was she like?" asked Mr. Plantagenet. "What was she like?" asked Birdie. "What was she like?" asked Apple. "She was valuable," said Tottie. "She was little and heavy." "What was she made of?" "I am made of celluloid," said Birdie. "Marchpane was made of kid and china," said Tottie. "Kid? What is kid?" "It is a kind of leather, white leather," said Tottie. "Her body was made of it, and stuffed with sawdust and jointed. Her joints worked more smoothly than mine. Her head was china, and her eyes were china too. Her hair was real, in a plait that they pinned round her head. You could plait it and unplait it." "Was it yellow?" asked Birdie. "Yes," said Tottie mournfully. "Did her clothes take on and off?" asked Apple, who hated to have his clothes taken off. "She was in wedding clothes," said Tottie. "They took off, and they were all white." "Arrgh!" said Dana suddenly. They looked at him in surprise. They all looked round for the danger, and could not see any. It was late autumn. It was cold in the shoeboxes in the colder weather. Their cardboard sides were thin and too low to keep out draughts, and Mr. Plantagenet began to suffer. He was a delicate little doll, and he looked quite drawn with cold. Emily was knitting Tottie a cloak in red wool. "I do wish she were knitting a muffler or a little waistcoat for Mr. Plantagenet instead," said Tottie. Then it happened, in that very autumn, that Emily and Charlotte's great-aunt died. The very great-aunt who had been the little girl of that great-great-aunt Laura who had owned the doll's house and gathered the shells at the seaside. Her relations and friends found a doll's house in the attic. "Fancy this being here," said the friends and relations. "What shall we do with it?" "It could be sold," they said. "It really is as good as new." This was not quite true, for it was dusty and thick with dirt. The butler had gone quite to dust. The velvet of the sofa and chairs was rotten and ripped. The shells had come off the pictures in places, and the lace curtains were torn. "Still, it would fetch a good price," they said. "I don't think it ought to be sold," said one relation who perhaps had more heart than the others. "It was played with by great-aunt, perhaps by her mother. Are there no little girls in the family who might like to play with it now? There were 2 little girls. They were Emily and Charlotte. The letter came at breakfast, when the Plantagenet family were on the hearthrug where Charlotte had arranged them, pretending it was a park. When Mother read the letter, they listened with all their ears. "Can we have it, Mother?" begged Emily and Charlotte. "Oh, can we? Can we?" begged the Plantagenet family. "You'd better ask Father." "Can we, Father? Can we? Can we? Can we?" begged the Plantagenets. Apple was getting nearer and nearer to the coal. "We had better take it," said Father, "and then we can advertise it in the newspapers and get £25. "Do we need £25? asked Mr. Plantagenet, but Tottie told him Father was only teasing. "A house," said Mr. Plantagenet, forgetting Father. "I suppose it is that house, Tottie." "I should think it must be," said Tottie, in her calming, calm wood voice. "An old doll's house that belonged to great-great-aunt Laura. What else could it be?" That dream house," said Mr. Plantagenet. "You didn't dream it. I told you of it," said Tottie, who was strictly truthful. She could see Mr. Plantagenet was getting into a state. "I can't believe it," said Mr. Plantagenet. I can't." "Yes, you can," said Tottie, easily. "Now, Father has said yes, it's going to happen." "No more shoe boxes," said Mr. Plantagenet with a catch in his voice. "And it has been awfully cold in those shoe boxes sometimes, hasn't it, Tottie?" His eyes looked as if they might break their glass. No doll can cry tears. They have to keep their tears in. But Mr. Plantagenet's eyes looked as if they had held tears of joy. "Happy ever after," said Mr. Plantagenet. "Happy ever after, Tottie." They had forgotten Marchpane. When the doll's house arrived, Marchpane was not in it. She had been sent to the cleaners. That was very bad for Marchpane. The cleaners took such care of her that it went to her head, which, being china, was empty, which is a very dangerous kind of head to have. Marchpane's was filled with thoughts of Marchpane, and at the cleaners she thought how wonderful Marchpane was, how valuable Marchpane was, how beautifully Marchpane was made, what elegant clothes Marchpane had, with what small, exquisite stitching. "I am a beautiful little creature, really I am," thought Marchpane. "I must be worth a fabulous amount of money. No wonder they are so careful of me." The cleaners took off her fine sewn wedding clothes and washed and cleaned them exquisitely so that they were whiter than snowdrops or snow. Then they cleaned Marchpane herself all over, and she was whiter too. But they cleaned her with petrol, and after it, I must confess, she smelled strongly and nastily of petrol. In fact, ever afterwards she had a faintly nasty smell, which was quite right because she was nasty. The cleaners redressed her and replaited her hair, which they had cleaned until it looked like golden floss. Then, having politely asked permission first, they put her on the counter of their shop with a card. "Mid-19th century doll, as cleaned by us." Marchpane stood on the counter, and everyone who came into the shop looked at her and admired her. Marchpane liked being looked at and admired more and more, though she thought, of course, it was only her due, and that the people were very lucky to have a chance to see such an elegant and beauteous doll as Marchpane. Charlotte and Emily, the Plantagenet family, had been busy. The doll's house was exactly as Tottie had described it, but, "Oh dear," said Mr. Plantagenet, and if the corners of his mouth had been made to turn down, they would have turned down. "Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear." On the doll's house and in it were years and years of dust and grime and cobwebs and mould and rust. The children and the Plantagenets looked at the tattered chair and sofa covers, at the torn old curtains, at the seashells fallen off the picture frames, at the remains of the butler. The blue tin stove was rusty, and so was the bath. The mangle was stuck, some of the kitchen chairs were broken, and the knit-round blankets were grey with mildew. "Oh dear, said Mr. Plantagenet. "Stop saying 'oh dear,'" said Tottie sharply. "But what shall we do? What can we do?" "We can wish," said Tottie, still sharply, because, truth to tell, she was feeling worried and anxious herself. Would the children be able to put it in order? That was the question in Tottie's mind. Wish, 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 said Tottie, and every knot and grain of her seemed to harden. She came from a tree. What shall we do? What can we? Said Mr. Plantagenet. Don't bleat. Wish, said Tottie hardly, and her hard voice made the wood sound so hard and firm that even Mr. Plantagenet took heart, and they all began to wish. Wish that Emily and Charlotte can put our house in order and make it good again. Go on, all of you, wish, 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 said Tottie. At that moment, among the Plantagenets appeared hands. Emily and Charlotte's hands, lifting them onto the mantelpiece out of the way where they could see. Then those same hands began to strip the doll's house. What did I tell you? Said Tottie. Emily and Charlotte and their mother took everything out of the doll's house. They took the carpets up from their tin tacks, and with the carpets came layers of dust. They did not look like carpets, but pieces of crinkled old grey flannel. Birdie hid her face in her hands. I wanted the pink one, and there isn't a pink one, she said. Wait and see, said Tottie. The carpets are filthy, said Mother. I will take them to wash and iron. What did I say? Said Tottie. Meanwhile, Charlotte was brushing down the walls and roof. Emily was brushing out the rooms and stairs. Then Charlotte fetched a pail of water and a cake of soap and her nail brush. Charlotte, do you think you ought to use that? Hush, said Charlotte, beginning to use it. She washed the walls and the roof, and Emily, after watching a moment, joined in and, fetching her nail brush, began to wash the floors and walls and ceilings. By the time she had finished, she herself was filthy, with a filthy overall and dirt marks on her cheeks. Then she took a dry cloth and dried the walls and roof and steps all over, then took a duster and polished them. Emily watched again and followed her. Indeed, it looked much better. The good paint, and paint was good in those days, had come up well, and the wallpapers from their brushing had lost their look of grime. Charlotte had knocked down a few more shells from the pictures, but Emily had fetched the glue and glued them on again, which was unusual for Emily because she did not usually do things for Charlotte. She also brushed and dusted the furniture, and rubbed the rust off the stove with sandpaper. She pulled the curtains down from the windows, to which they had been fastened with drawing pins, and ripped the covers off the sofa and the chairs. Soon, beds, chairs, and windows were left quite bare. You must wish about the curtains, said Tottie. You must wish about the couch and chairs. You must wish about the beds. Curtains, chairs, beds, said Mr. Plantagenet. He wished he could shut his eyes in order to wish harder, but of course he could not, because they were not made to shut. Over and over again, said Tottie. You must never leave off wishing. Beds, chairs, couch, curtains. Beds, chairs, couch, curtains. Beds, chairs. My cot, my own little cot, wished Apple. My bedroom feather. Birdie still did not know which to think of first. Beds, couch, curtains, chairs. The door opened, and the children's mother came in. Could she have washed those carpets already? Asked Mr. Plantagenet suspiciously. She answered him herself. I have washed the carpets, said Mother. They have come up beautifully. Now I've brought the scrap bag. We shall need new mattresses and pillows and sheets and blankets for the beds. And pillowcases, said Charlotte, for mouse-sized pillows. Emily stared at Charlotte, and so did the Plantagenets. It was not usually Charlotte who said things. Could I have a mouse-sized pillow? Asked Apple excitedly. A pillow for a very small mouse? I shall fetch the cotton wool, said Emily, and then I can stuff them as you make them. But, I don't want cotton wool for mine, cried Birdie. I want. Her head rattled so that she could not say what it was she wanted. Tottie began to wish. I think Birdie ought to have a feather bed, said Charlotte suddenly. Ah, said Birdie rapturously. Here are some bits of flannel for blankets. We can nick them round the edges, said Mother. And what do you think? Shall we make Apple a patchwork quilt for his cot? Could you make the patches small enough? Asked Emily. Mother thought she could. While I'm in this cleaning mood, said Charlotte, I'm going to wash the windows. What shall we do about curtains? Asked Charlotte. They should be lace, said Mother. Then Emily spoke. They must be real lace, said Emily. Mr. Plantagenet smiled. Real lace is very expensive, said Mother. I shall get my money box, answered Emily. "Get mine too," said Charlotte. Emily came back with the money boxes. They were rather empty. 8 and 10 all together, said Emily. "That might be enough, but there are other things we want as well," said Emily. "I shall measure the windows," said Charlotte, and she measured them with Mother's tape measure. "We should have to buy 3/4 of a yard of that real lace," said Charlotte, "and we should have 3 inches over. We could make a lace apron for Tottie." "Yes, but we need a new couch and chairs." The couch and chairs, now they were stripped, certainly looked in very bad repair. Their wooden arms and legs were scratched and stained, and they had no stuffing left on their seats and backs at all. "There are others in the shops," said Charlotte uncertainly. "Yes, ordinary ones," said Emily scornfully. Wouldn't ordinary ones do?" Charlotte was a little like Birdie. She was happy with ordinary things, but Emily was not. "This doll's house is special," said Emily. "You know it is, Charlotte. It's an antique," said Emily. "I know what would look very beautiful on that holly green carpet," Emily was saying slowly. "Do you know, Charlotte?" "What?" asked Charlotte. "Do you remember looking at that shop in Wigmore Street," said Emily, "where they had that little set of doll's house chairs and couch? They're very old, and they were made of real oak. It said so, and they were red velvet, too." "And there was a table," said Charlotte dreamily, "and it had a red runner and a fringe." "Yes," said Emily. "Yes," said Charlotte. "Yes," said the Plantagenets. "Those were terribly expensive," said Emily. "Then we shall have to have ordinary lace and chairs." "We can't," said Emily. "We shan't." "But what shall we do?" "We shall do what other people do when they want things," said Emily. "We must make money." Tottie and the doll's house were not the only things in the house that had belonged to Emily and Charlotte's great-grandmother and great-great-aunt Laura. There was as well a sampler. "What is a sampler?" asked Apple. "It is a needlework picture to hang on a wall," Tottie explained to him. "It is all worked in cross-stitch on fine canvas, and sometimes, most times, the stitches are very fine indeed." Great-grandmother's sampler hung in the children's room. It was long in shape and framed in a narrow wooden frame. It was worked in baskets of flowers on a cream background, and it had a verse. Charlotte did not like to look at the sampler. She said it gave her a headache, but Emily liked it. Sometimes she begged Mother to give her a certain little set of clothes, Tottie's first clothes, as old as the sampler. These clothes were not beautiful ones like marchpanes. They were the ordinary clothes that might have been made for any little doll in those times. A bodice with tucks, a pair of long-legged drawers scalloped to match, and a dress of India muslin embroidered in blue flowers, and a very little blue bonnet to match that had white embroidery. Emily liked to dress Tottie in these and stand her underneath the sampler. "Let's put her there today, Charlotte," said Emily next afternoon. "Mrs. Innisfree is coming to tea." Both the children loved Mrs. Innisfree, who was always interested in their dolls. Emily dressed Tottie and stood her under the sampler and even wrote a ticket that said, not unlike the cleaner's notice for marchpane, "Example of a real old sampler worked by a little girl in 1846. "Poor little girl," said Charlotte indignantly. Emily took no notice. She wrote, "Example of a farthing doll dressed by that same little girl in 1846. There was a sound of footsteps outside the door, and Mrs. Innisfree came in. She admired Tottie and the sampler, and she admired the doll's house, and she sat down by the fire and listened to the whole story of it. "It's a pity about the chairs and the couch," said Mrs. Innisfree. Emily told her about the set in Wigmore Street, and then she and Charlotte fell silent. "They sound the very thing," said Mrs. Innisfree. "Will you buy them?" "No," said Emily. "No," said Charlotte. "At least, not yet," said Emily with a faraway brightness in her eyes. "I see," said Mrs. Innisfree, and her eyes went to Tottie. "It is strange," she said, "that you should have arranged Tottie like that for me to see. I'm having an exhibition," said Mrs. Innisfree. "At least part of it is mine. It's called Dolls Through the Ages, and it is to help the Blind Children's Fund. I wonder if your little doll and sampler could be in it." "You mean just as they are now?" asked Charlotte. "Example of a real old sampler worked by a little girl in 1846, and example of a farthing doll dressed by that same little girl in 1846. "Yes, I mean that," said Mrs. Innisfree. "I think your mother would let you. And," said Mrs. Innisfree, "we pay for some of the dolls, and I should like to pay you for Tottie." When Tottie heard these words, she gave a little gasp, but no one heard her. "How much would you pay?" Charlotte was saying. "Would you pay a whole pound?" "Charlotte," said Emily, and tried to kick her gently on the ankle. "But we need a whole pound," said Charlotte. "We should pay a guinea," said Mrs. Innisfree. Tottie gave another sound, and this time it was a groan, but Apple was tugging at her skirt. "That would be enough," said Charlotte, nodding her head. "After 100 years!" cried Tottie. "Then will you let me take Tottie and the sampler away?" asked Mrs. Innisfree. "Take Tottie away!" cried Mr. Plantagenet, and stopped. "Tottie, going away?" asked Birdie. "Tottie, going away?" asked little Apple, and he said firmly, "No!" "Now, Apple—" "No, no, no!" cried Apple. Tottie said nothing at all. She stood as if, instead of being wood, she had turned to stone, and when Emily picked her up and wrapped her in white paper to give her to Mrs. Innisfree, Tottie lay cold and heavy in her hand. Emily felt misery and reproach from Tottie, but she did not understand why. Can you guess why? Tottie was wrapped up and packed in a box, the box laid on top of the sampler with the 2 notices, and they were all handed to Mrs. Innisfree. In the night, Apple would not sleep without Tottie. Birdie had no wish to sleep, and even Mr. Plantagenet did not feel quite comfortable. "Go to sleep, Apple, do," he said. "You go to sleep," said Apple, but Mr. Plantagenet could not. Emily and Charlotte were strangely restless too. "Emily," said Charlotte at last from her bed. "Yes, Charlotte." "You'll be cross," said Charlotte. "I don't think I will," said Emily. I think I know what you're thinking, Charlotte." "Well," said Charlotte, and she lay on her back looking thoughtfully up at the ceiling. "Well, people usually do, don't they?" "Do what?" "Lend, not be paid," said Charlotte. "Yes," said Emily miserably. "I mean, for an exhibition like that, which is to help people, people usually lend their things, don't they, to help the other people?" "That's what I was thinking, remembering," said Emily. "We have hired out Tottie." "That is what she didn't like," said Charlotte, and she was near the truth, though that was not the whole truth. "I felt her being miserable, but I didn't take any notice." "Then," said Emily. "Nor I," said Charlotte, "but I wish I had." "I believe Mrs. Innisfree offered to pay us because she was sorry we couldn't get the chairs," said Emily. "We shall go to Mrs. Innisfree in the morning and tell her," said Emily. Mrs. Innisfree was surprised to see them when they called at her house the next morning. She seemed more surprised than pleased when Emily laid the pound note and the shilling on the table. "After all," said Charlotte, "we're not blind, and if we don't get paid for Tottie, the children who are blind will get more money." "Emily," said Mrs. Innisfree, "you wanted those chairs badly, didn't you?" "Yes," said Emily, "but Charlotte likes the doll's house just as much as I do." "Now I have another idea," said Mrs. Innisfree. "You must remember that while this was happening, Tottie was packed away in her box under her paper and had no idea of it at all. You must keep remembering that." "I want," said Mrs. Innisfree, "to see those old chairs and that old couch, the ones that were in the doll's house when it came." "But they're all torn and unstuffed." "But the wooden part, the legs and arms and frames, well, that's still there," said Charlotte. "They should be as good as new, if they were as good in the first place as I think they were." "As good as the Wigmore Street ones," said Mrs. Innisfree. "Go and get them now. I might be able to do something with them, if they are as I hope." "Are they?" asked Charlotte an hour later when she and Emily had come back. "Are they what?" "As you hoped." "Yes, they are," said Mrs. Innisfree. The sofa and the chairs stood on the table in her drawing-room. "Look," she said, and with her scissors she ripped off what Emily had left of the stuffing, the torn bits and the dirty old cotton. Soon the chairs and sofa were bare down to their seats. "Look," said Mrs. Innisfree, "the wood is good, quite solid. Do you see, Emily, the little legs are turned. They're scratched and discoloured, but the good work is there. Do you see that when things are beautifully made, how beautifully they last?" "They don't look as if they had lasted," objected Charlotte. "They look fit to throw away." "That's because you haven't looked into them. Wait and see," said Mrs. Innisfree. She opened a drawer and took out 2 pieces of sandpaper and rubbed them against each other. "That's to smooth them a little because they're too rough. They must not scratch the wood too deeply." She picked up a little chair and began to rub its leg. "But you're taking all its polish off." "And the dirt and the scratches. Now, You and Charlotte rub them, and when they're quite clean and smooth, we shall take them to a man I know who is a French polisher, and we shall ask him if he will help us. I think he will," said Mrs. Innisfree. "But what about the seats and arms and backs? They were all cushioned before. They can be cushioned again." "But with what? Mother says that nowhere, anywhere, can you buy stuff like that they were cushioned with," said Emily. "Have you seen this?" asked Mrs. Innisfree, and she picked up a footstool that was standing by the table and showed it to them. "This is called petit point. Have you ever seen a chair like it?" asked Mrs. Innisfree. "A tapestry chair?" "Oh," said Emily. "Oh, you mean—" "Yes. What could be better than tiny tapestry chairs and couch?" asked Mrs. Innisfree. "Doll's tapestry would have to be very, very fine," said Emily slowly. "Could anybody work it?" she asked doubtfully. "I have worked it so that it was very fine indeed." "It would be beautiful," breathed Charlotte. "But we couldn't do it, not Emily nor I. Now, who—" Mrs. Innisfree had not answered. She had opened a drawer and was taking out a roll of fine canvas and a box of silks. "You!" said Emily and Charlotte together. "You! You mean you would work it for us?" "It would not take me very long," said Mrs. Innisfree. "I think I could do it. Anyway, I could try. Suppose you stay to lunch with me, and then we could choose patterns and colours." "Of course, we shall need an upholsterer as well as a French polisher," said Mrs. Innisfree. "But I have another friend who would do that for us." They had lunch with Mrs. Innisfree, and after lunch they looked through the patterns and silk and chose a small pattern that was part of a larger pattern. It was moss rosebuds in crimson and pink with green leaves on a cream background. They had asked to peep at Tottie before they left Mrs. Innisfree, and how surprised Tottie was to see their faces bending over her. "Is this all a bad dream?" asked Tottie of herself. "Am I at home again?" But as soon as Charlotte lifted her up, she saw that she was in a strange room, and that the box still lay on the table. "It isn't a dream," cried Tottie in Charlotte's hand. "Oh, oh, oh!" "When does she go to the exhibition?" she heard Emily ask, just before they put on the lid. "To the exhibition! To the exhibition!" said Tottie in a cry so loud that every knot and grain of her felt twisted, but of course not a sound came out of the box. Marchpane had been seen by someone at the cleaner's who had taken her address and written to the great-aunt's relations to ask if Marchpane too might not come to the exhibition. The great-aunt's relations said yes. Marchpane was delighted. Tottie had never seen so many ladies and so many dolls, particularly so many dolls. There was every kind of doll: baby dolls, little girl dolls, boy dolls, lady and gentleman dolls, soldier dolls, sailor dolls, acting dolls, dancing dolls, clockwork dolls, fairy dolls, Chinese dolls, Polish, Japanese, French, German, Russian. There was a white wax doll with exquisite white china hands, and a Dutch fisherman with a basket on his back, and a Flemish doll in market clothes, and her cook sitting down with her basket. There was every kind and sort of doll, and they filled the room, each standing in its place and showing what kind of doll it was. Some of them were very handsome and imposing. All of them, without exception, were far, far larger than Tottie. She felt small and shy and longed to go home. "But I can't go home," said Tottie. "I shall never go home again." And her secret trouble filled her so strongly that if wood could have drooped, Tottie would have drooped. "Oh, oh, oh!" cried poor little Tottie, and she thought of them all at home. A lady took her up in her hand. "Where shall we put this darling little thing?" she asked. "Look, she goes with this sampler." "What a charming idea," said another, but Tottie did not think it was in the least bit charming. "A farthing doll," said another lady. "Why, I should think she must be unique." Tottie did not know what unique meant. If you don't, go and look it up in the dictionary. For all she could tell, it might be something rude. On the table opposite Tottie were 4 dolls under a glass-domed cover. Next to her, on her right side, was a wax doll with a satin dress, and on the other side, a walking doll dressed in blue satin with a bustle behind and white flounces. She held, tip-tilted, a blue parasol, and in the other tiny hand, a fan. Who are those in the case?" asked Tottie. They were Queen Victoria's dolls when she was a child, said the wax doll. Ooh, said Tottie. She remembered Queen Victoria, of course. La, we have been put in one of the best positions. Is it, you say, in the room, said the walking doll. Why does she talk like that? Asked Tottie in a whisper of the wax doll. She's French, said the wax doll. She's very proud. The walking doll held her tip-tilted parasol and her fan and glanced at Tottie. What is your arm made of? She asked. Pardonnez-moi, but I do not recognize the substance. I am made of wood, answered Tottie with dignity. Wood? La la la. Tee! Her laughing sounded as if it were wound up. Tee! La la. I thought doorknobs and broom handles and bedposts and clothes pegs were made of wood, not dolls. So they are, said Tottie, and so are the masts of ships and flagpoles and violins and trees, said Tottie. I am made of kid and porcelain, said the walking doll. Inside I have a little set of works. Wind me up and I walk. Walk, 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 cried the other dolls. Merci! Je ne marcherai pas ce qui ça me chante, which means she would not walk unless she wanted. But of course she could not walk unless someone wound her up. I once knew a kid doll, said Tottie. I did not like her. Who is talking about kid dolls? Came a voice from the opposite table. Who did not like kid dolls? I don't, said Tottie firmly, though at the sound of that voice she felt as if instead of being wood all through, she might have been made hollow inside. And who are you? Said the voice. It is a little object, said the walking doll, that has found its way in here. Ha! It is made of wood. Of wood? Said the voice. Once I knew a little doll made of wood, and I did not like her at all. I have never seen one, said the walking doll. They were sold in the cheaper shops. The children, silly little things, would waste their money on them. Ha! Children, merci, je ne mange pas de ce lapin-là. Horrible little creatures, je les déteste. Silly little things? Little creatures? Those are children they are talking of, said the wax doll, shocked. Her voice, after the others, was meltingly soft. How dare they, said the wax doll. They don't deserve the name of doll. Tottie looked across at the other table, and she saw Marchpane. Marchpane saw her. Oh, it's you, said Marchpane. Yes, said Tottie. For some time now there had been whispers going on among the dolls, and now the walking doll was listening. Ah, is it possible? She asked. No, no, je m'en doute. What is it? Said Marchpane. They say that some of the dolls here are to be sold out of their families. What? Sold? By your own family? Sold? 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 Ran the whisper among the dolls. La, quel malheur, said the walking doll. My museum would never part with me. Nor mine, said Marchpane quickly. Nor mine, said the wax doll, but she said it with a fluttering sigh. You noticed that Tottie had said nothing all this time. This was Tottie's secret trouble. Yes, Tottie thought that Emily and Charlotte had sold her to Mrs. Innisfree. Of course, Tottie did not know that Emily and Charlotte had given the money back to Mrs. Innisfree. She thought she was sold and would presently be sold again. She was filled with shame. The other dolls were longing for the exhibition to open. Do you think there will be any children? Asked the wax doll with longing in her voice. Children? I hope not, said Marchpane. I hope they will not touch, said the haughty doll. They had better not touch me, said Marchpane. That must certainly not be allowed. But were you not meant to be played with? Asked the wax doll. I was. La, you are unhappy? I am shut away in a box, away from children, and it is children who give us life, said the wax doll. And tumble one about and spoil one, said Marchpane. And the walking doll shuddered to the tip of her parasol. Isn't that life? Asked Tottie. Is it true, said one of the dolls, that this exhibition is to be opened by a queen? Queen Victoria? Asked the wax doll, looking at the dolls in the glass case. Tottie whispered to her that Queen Victoria had been dead long, long ago. Forgive me, said the wax doll. I've been shut away so long. A queen, said Marchpane with great satisfaction. How right and proper. She will be sure to notice me. They always do, she said, though Tottie was sure she had never seen a queen before. Now the day came for the exhibition to be open. By 11 o'clock everything was dusted and ready. The ladies were waiting, the dolls were waiting, and a great number of other ladies and gentlemen and a few children, invited guests, were waiting. There was a stir, a pause. The Queen had come. Presently they heard her voice. The Queen's voice was as clear, her words as distinct as separate drops of water. Clear and cool, clear and cool. Tottie had heard that about water once, and the Queen's voice sounded to her like that. "I have great pleasure in declaring this exhibition open," said the Queen's voice, and there was an immediate clapping of hands. "Why are they clapping?" asked the wax doll. "They're clapping us, of course," said Marchpane. "They're clapping the Queen," said Tottie. Now the ladies and gentlemen following the Queen, who was attended by the ladies of the exhibition and her own lady-in-waiting, began to come down the tables looking at the dolls. "But she isn't wearing a crown," said the wax doll, disappointed. "She only wears a crown when she goes to Parliament and places like that," said Tottie, who had learned about kings and queens when her little girls, from great-grandmother down to Charlotte, learned their history. "She has the most elegant hat with grey feathers," said Marchpane. "I shall have one copied for myself. Shh, shh, she's coming this way." "La, I am nervous," said the walking doll. "Je ne me sens pas bien du tout," which means she did not herself feel well. The wax doll trembled, but the people thought it was their footsteps shaking the room. Tottie remained woodenly staring in front of her. On the Queen came, stopping, looking, touching this doll or that, asking questions. Then she stopped directly in front of Marchpane, as Marchpane had known she would. "What a beautiful little doll," said the Queen. "Surely she is the smallest in the exhibition." Now, in Marchpane's ears, the Queen could not have asked a more unfortunate question. Marchpane was not the smallest doll in the exhibition. Tottie was, and Marchpane hated her for that. She almost cracked her china as she heard Mrs. Innisfree say, "There is one even smaller, ma'am, this little farthing doll," and saw the Queen turn away to Tottie. "Oh," said the Queen, "oh, I used to play with wooden dolls like this when I was a little girl." "A queen with wooden dolls! How very surprising," said the other dolls. "La, comme c'est drôle," said the walking doll. As for Marchpane, she said nothing. She was afraid she really would crack if she did. "I haven't seen one for years and years," said the Queen. "My nurse used to buy them for me." And then she asked the very question Tottie was dreading to hear. "Is she for sale?" asked the Queen. Every knot and grain in Tottie hardened as she waited for the answer to come. Whispers ran up and down amongst the dolls. "I should like to buy her if she is," said the Queen. "I'm afraid not, ma'am," said Mrs. Innisfree. "She isn't for sale. She is the very dear possession of 2 little girls," and she pointed to the card. The Queen picked up the cards and read them out. "Sampler worked by a little girl in 1846. Farthing doll dressed by the same little girl in 1846. Lent by her great-granddaughters Emily and Charlotte Dane in 1946. "Of course," said the Queen. "She must be a great treasure. May I look at her?" And Tottie was picked up in the pale grey glove of the Queen, who examined her and examined her clothes. "Dear little thing," said the Queen, and gave Tottie back to Mrs. Innisfree and passed on down the tables. "My dear, you have had a cessez-fou," said the haughty doll. Tottie did not ask what a cessez-fou was. For the first time her wood felt weak, bending, and then one of the ladies ran forward with a cry. "Oh dear," she said, "the little farthing doll has fallen over and rolled down right off the table." Meanwhile, the Plantagenet family had moved into the doll's house. They had made it completely their own. Though the chairs were not ready yet and the lace curtains had not come, Mr. Plantagenet, Birdie, Apple, and Dana had settled down. The house was clean from top to bottom. No family could have been happier than the Plantagenets were now. Dana had his kennel to himself, and it was filled with real chopped-up straw that Emily had begged from a stable in the mews and cut up with her scissors. Apple had the whole house to play in, and he had learned the dangerous practice of somersaulting down the stairs. Birdie had her room with the pink carpet, and every morning she dusted it with her feather broom while she sang all the songs that she felt her bird in the birdcage would sing. "Do I sing with my hands and dust with my voice?" asked Birdie. "I might, I do not know, but I am happy, happy, happy," and she flicked with the feather broom and sang a trill. "So happy," sang Birdie. Emily had made her a fly-away apron with embroidery cotton strings that were pink like the carpet. And Mr. Plantagenet. Mr. Plantagenet was different. He looked heavier. The porcelain of his face and hands seemed brighter, cleaner. The checks on his suit seemed more clearly marked, his red ribbon tie more crisp. When he held his walking stick, it looked as if he would swing it at any moment. They had kept a place for Tottie. There was a bed waiting for her in the same room as Apple, the room with the blue carpet. Mr. Plantagenet slept with Birdie. "It doesn't feel like our home without Tottie," said Mr. Plantagenet. The exhibition was almost over. Many people had visited it. It was a great success. Most of the people had taken notice of Tottie. What a little love of a doll, they had said. Emily and Charlotte had been several times to visit her. Dear possession, thought Tottie, a great treasure. Emily and Charlotte had looked at Marchpane and admired her very much, especially Emily. They knew she had belonged to great-great-aunt Laura, but they did not know she had lived with Tottie in the doll's house. The last day came. Tottie, with every minute, grew more happy and excited. "You are lucky," sighed the wax doll. "Tell us about this house you are in," said the walking doll. Tottie had always thought it better not to talk about the house in front of Marchpane, but now she was so excited and happy herself, and so sorry for the other dolls, that she forgot to take care. She began to tell about the doll's house. "Don't you believe her," cried Marchpane in a loud voice. "That isn't her house, it's mine." All the dolls looked at Marchpane, then they all looked at Tottie. "You stole it while I was at the cleaners." "It's in our nursery now," said Tottie. "It was sent to us, as you were sent to the cleaners. It needed cleaning and taking care of," said Tottie. "We cleaned it and took care of it." "How dare you!" cried Marchpane. "You think because the Queen noticed you, you can do anything. Wait and see, wait and see," cried Marchpane. "I shall have that house back." The exhibition was closed. The dolls had been taken away, the room was empty, and when the caretaker's child came in the evening, there were only long blank tables where Tottie and Marchpane and Queen Victoria's dolls and the walking doll and the wax doll and the other dolls had been. Tottie came back, and it was winter, but so far there was no snow. Emily and Charlotte took her with them when they went to Mrs. Innisfree's house to fetch the couch and the chairs. "Tottie ought to go, because it was Tottie who really got the chairs for us," said Emily. Emily made Tottie a cotton wool cap and a cotton wool muff to go out in, as it was beginning to be bitterly cold. "But we're cosy in the doll's house," said Mr. Plantagenet. The whiteness of the cotton wool looked pretty with Tottie's glossy black hair and painted cheeks. She shone with happiness. Tottie was carried along to Mrs. Innisfree's on the palm of Charlotte's hand. Charlotte had on a red woolen glove. Tottie had on her red woolen cloak, her cap and muff. They went well together. Emily and Charlotte were talking of Christmas, and Tottie was suddenly reminded of a little sunshade, a parasol, made from paper from a cracker. "How I should like to give Birdie one for Christmas. I wish," said Tottie, sitting on Charlotte's hand. "And for Apple, a marble. A marble would make him a good ball. And for Dana, a Tiddlywinks plate, a nice big purple one. And for Mr. Plantagenet, I wish they would think of getting him a toy post office," thought Tottie. When they arrived in Mrs. Innisfree's house, on the table in her drawing-room were the couch and chairs. Their wood, having been carefully sandpapered, had been polished by Mrs. Innisfree's French polisher until it shone with a real furniture dark wood shine of its own. Then the petit point seats and arms and backs had been fastened over new cushions. Mrs. Innisfree had worked the cream background and the tiny roses and leaves. "Oh!" cried Tottie. "Oh, it was worth going to the exhibition." Then Mrs. Innisfree put down on the table 2 pairs of fine white lace curtains. "I saw the pieces of lace," she said, "and there is a piece over, so I made an apron for Tottie." On Christmas morning, the Plantagenets woke to hear real carol singers in the street outside. "Peace and goodwill among men," sang the carol singers. "And among dolls," said Mr. Plantagenet. "I hope among dolls." The doll's house that Christmas looked very pleasant. Emily and Charlotte had decorated it. They made wreaths of moss on curtain rings that looked like holly wreaths, and they had strung holly berries for garlands. Emily had even made a paper chain with very small links. The new chairs and couch looked handsome in the drawing-room, and there was a Christmas tree 6 inches high standing in a wooden pot. It was the kind of Christmas tree you have on Christmas cakes. "Would you like to give one of the Plantagenets this for Christmas?" asked the children's mother, coming into the room. "I must have had it at a party long ago." She showed them a parasol made of white paper printed with a pattern of purple and scarlet feathers. "Oh, for Birdie!" cried Emily at once. How odd, thought Tottie. How lovely and how odd. "And for Apple, a marble. Wouldn't a marble make a ball for Apple? And Dana might have a new plate," said Charlotte. "This big tiddlywink would do. It's a purple one. That would suit him nicely." More and more odd, thought Tottie. For Mr. Plantagenet, they hung a buttonhole on the tree. It was made of woolen flowers. "I don't much like that," thought Tottie. Mr. Plantagenet did not much like it either. At that moment, the postman's knock sounded from the front door. Emily and Charlotte ran to open it. He had brought 2 parcels, a light thin one, the shape of a flat cardboard box, and a small one, the shape of a child's shoebox. Emily opened the flat one first. "What is it?" asked Charlotte. "What is it?" "Oh!" she cried as Emily set up a cardboard counter painted with netting. "Oh! It's a post office! A toy post office!" "Oh!" cried Tottie, and she caught Mr. Plantagenet's eye. The toy post office was complete. It even had 2 letterboxes labelled packets and newspapers and letters. It had a red telephone and a purple ink pad for the stamps. "But what shall we do with it exactly?" asked Charlotte. "I know," said Emily slowly. "I know, Charlotte. It shall be Mr. Plantagenet's office. He shall go there to business every day." "As a postman?" asked Charlotte. "As a postmaster," said Emily. "A postmaster," said Mr. Plantagenet, and his waistcoat seemed to swell and grow bigger. "Did you hear, Tottie? I am a postmaster." Dana was looking at the other parcel. All his wool stood on end. "Urgh," said Dana at the parcel. At the moment Dana barked at the parcel, the Plantagenet family were all in the post office that Emily had set up on the table. As Dana barked, Tottie remembered the other parcel, and for no reason that she could put a name to, she found herself wishing and wishing and wishing that Emily would put them all back in the house. She must have wished very purposefully, as Emily raised her head and said, "I think they must all go back into the doll's house now." "In the doll's house and behind the door. Shut the door," wished Tottie. "After all, Mr. Plantagenet wouldn't go to office on Christmas Day," said Emily. Charlotte put the Plantagenets tidily back in the house. Apple on the stairs, ready to somersault, Birdie in her bedroom with the pink carpet, Mr. Plantagenet in the sitting room, and Tottie in the kitchen. "Now, you're all in your happy little house," said Charlotte. She did not close the front. "Our happy little house," sang Apple as he began his somersaults. He reached the bottom, and to his great joy, Charlotte looked up and said, "Oh, he's fallen downstairs. Poor little Apple," and put him up again. Charlotte had given Tottie the pudding basin tied in a scrap of white muslin, and said she was turning out the Christmas pudding. But Tottie felt too nervous to think about puddings. She could hear Dana in his kennel, still saying, "Urgh," and Dana never said, "Urgh," except for danger. Through the open front of the doll's house, Tottie watched Emily undo that parcel. The shoebox was padded with cotton wool and paper. Emily and Charlotte lifted it out piece by piece, and then Emily gave a cry of admiration and pleasure. "Look, Charlotte, look! It's a doll! That lovely doll!" And she lifted Marchpane from the box. "Oh, I loved her at the exhibition," cried Emily. "You remember her, Charlotte? She'd been sent to us because she was great-great-Aunt Laura's doll. She goes with the doll's house, you see." "Does she?" asked Charlotte doubtfully. She looked at Marchpane and then at the Plantagenet so happily settled in the doll's house. Emily had no eyes for anyone but Marchpane. "She doesn't smell very nice," said Charlotte. "Oh, Charlotte, I loved her at the exhibition," said Emily, "and now she's ours." "I don't remember her very well at the exhibition," said Charlotte slowly. "She wasn't ours then, and we went there to see Tottie." "Yes, but we looked at her." "I didn't. I looked at Tottie." "Don't be such a little silly, Charlotte," said Emily. "What is the matter with you?" "I don't know," said Charlotte. "I have a funny feeling." "Well, you're very silly. She's perfectly beautiful. She must be our best doll." "But," began Charlotte, and then she said in a low voice, "You think we ought to have a best doll, Emily?" They brought Marchpane into the doll's house. Tottie stood by the kitchen table, stiff and hard. Emily brought Marchpane into the kitchen first. "You should remember each other," she said to Tottie. "We remember each other," said Marchpane and Tottie. "Of course, they first knew each other years and years ago," said Emily. "They must know secrets about each other that we don't know." "We do," said Tottie. Marchpane said nothing at all. Presently, Emily took her into the sitting room and sat her on the couch by Mr. Plantagenet, and then she shut the front of the doll's house and went away to lunch. When Mr. Plantagenet saw Marchpane sitting opposite him, he was quite dazzled. He dropped his newspaper and stared with both his dark glass eyes. "Don't do that," said Marchpane sharply. Don't do what? Stare and stare and stare, said Marchpane. It's very rude. I'm sorry, said Mr. Plantagenet politely, but I can't help staring. I suppose they are fixed, said Marchpane, looking at him. Fixed? They don't open and shut. Open and shut? Your eyes, said Marchpane. Take them off me at once. Excuse me, said Mr. Plantagenet, still more politely. My eyes are not on you. They are in me. Ho, said Marchpane. You should be in the hall, not sitting in a chair. If you sit at all, it should be in the kitchen. Excuse me, said Mr. Plantagenet again. I am the master of this house. Do you know that carol? He asked. God bless the master of this house. God bless the mistress too. Well, I am the master, and Bertie is the mistress. That she certainly is not, said Marchpane. Oh, yes, she is, said Mr. Plantagenet positively. She isn't, I am, said Marchpane. You, said Mr. Plantagenet. Oh, no, how could you be? There was a sudden bump, bump, bump on the other side of the wall. What is that? Asked Marchpane. That is Apple, our little boy. He belongs to us. Does he? Asked Marchpane thoughtfully. There was a light sound of rustling from upstairs. What is that? Asked Marchpane. That is Birdie. What is she doing? Asked Marchpane. I expect she's dusting the paper chains with her feather broom, said Mr. Plantagenet. Paper chains? With a feather broom? What a very odd thing to do. It's an aggravating noise, said Marchpane. I wish you would stop her. Oh, no, I shouldn't like to disturb her. I shall disturb her, said Marchpane. A thought came into Mr. Plantagenet's mind. A horrible thought. Then he looked at Marchpane. Excuse me, said Mr. Plantagenet timidly, but which is your room? The one with the pink carpet, of course, said Marchpane smartly. But that's Birdie's. She chose it. That's Birdie's nest. If you really want to know, said Marchpane in her flat, heavy voice, the whole house is mine. What? Cried poor Mr. Plantagenet. He could not believe his little porcelain ears. But it's our house, ours. It is mine, and really, said Marchpane, yawning again, I can't live in it with all these people. I must tell Emily and Charlotte. And she yawned still once again. Oh, don't say that, cried poor little Mr. Plantagenet. But I do say it, said Marchpane. What you don't know, said Marchpane, is that I was here in this doll's house long, long years ago, long before any of you. Not before Tottie you weren't, said Mr. Plantagenet, and as he said it his eyes grew steady and his voice grew suddenly firm. Tottie has been here as long as you have. Why, she remembers your coming. She has been here longer. Tottie, a farthing doll. At that moment Charlotte opened the front of the doll's house and picked up Tottie. I don't see, said Charlotte, why you should be left all alone in the kitchen, and she sat Tottie down on the couch next to Marchpane. There, said Charlotte to Marchpane, and shut the doll's house front again. Did you hear what she said about Birdie and our house, our dear, dear house? Oh, Tottie, I feel as if we were in danger, said Mr. Plantagenet. We are in danger, thought Tottie, but she did not say it aloud, because she knew Marchpane must not know they were in the least frightened. She smiled at Marchpane and said, How strange for you to be back. Oh, what are we going to do, Tottie? Cried Mr. Plantagenet. We must wish, said Tottie openly. We must wish, and we must never stop wishing for a moment. Charlotte, said Emily, we must take Birdie and Mr. Plantagenet out of the pink bedroom. We need it for Marchpane. But, began Charlotte, you gave it to them. Well, where is she to go? Would you put her in the attic? No, but where are they to go? They must go in with Tottie and Apple, said Emily. There isn't room. Then they must go in the attic. There isn't even a bed, Emily. There is a cotton reel box, said Emily. They must sleep in that. We can make it quite pretty for them. There was not even time to warn Birdie. Emily turned all her clothes and her apron out of the cupboard and cut down the paper chains, and she swept them all into the attic before anyone could say a word of warning to Birdie. What will she do? What will she say? My poor Birdie, cried Mr. Plantagenet. She will never understand. But oddly enough, Birdie understood only too well. Of course, said Birdie, she couldn't sleep in a cotton reel box, could she? No, said Mr. Plantagenet. When I first saw her, I thought she was a Christmas tree fairy. "Did you?" asked Birdie, and for the first time her voice sounded wistful. Then she said in her own brisk little voice, "After all, I came from a cracker box. Why shouldn't I sleep in a cotton reel box?" "You're getting muddled," said Mr. Plantagenet. "And remember, Birdie, don't go into her room." Birdie could not remember. She was always being found in Marchpane's room, still thinking it was hers. "Don't you like my pink carpet?" she would ask Marchpane. "My pink carpet," said Marchpane. "Get out of my room." "My room!" cried poor Birdie. "My room, my carpet, my bed. Get back to your cotton reel box." "She is cruel," said Mr. Plantagenet, trembling. "I hate her." "Don't waste time hating," said Tottie. "You must wish. I wish. We must wish." But the wishing showed no sign of changing anything, or perhaps Marchpane was wishing harder. Emily was now doing everything for Marchpane, nothing for the Plantagenets, though Charlotte tried to prevent this. "Charlotte is on our side," said Tottie. "Yes, but Emily isn't, and Emily is the one who does things far more than Charlotte." Things grew worse and worse for the Plantagenets. "I know," said Emily one day. "Let us pretend that they are the servants. They can sleep in the attic and stay in the kitchen. Let them be Marchpane's servants." "Oh, no, Emily, oh, no," said Charlotte, shocked. "How can they be? Marchpane is more like their aunt or their stepsister." "She isn't like a sister," said Emily. "She is a lady, and I don't want them in the sitting room with her." Emily had her way, and the Plantagenets were told to keep in the kitchen. Mr. Plantagenet could not understand it. "I'm not what she called me, Tottie. I'm not the butler, am I?" "You shan't be the butler," said Tottie. But Emily put in her hand and took up Mr. Plantagenet. "You are the butler," said Emily. "Go and open the door." "Shouldn't we put up the post office for Mr. Plantagenet?" suggested Charlotte. "He can't have it now," said Emily. "He's being the butler, and Birdie can be cook." "But would Birdie make a very good cook?" asked Charlotte miserably. "You know how muddled she gets." "Very well, she can be the maid, and Tottie can be the cook." "Tottie can be the cook," said Charlotte, reeling. "Yes, we can make her a dear little cap and apron. But Tottie, Emily." "I don't care," said Emily in a hard voice. "I want a cook for Marchpane, and Tottie must be the cook." Now the Plantagenets of the doll's house were only allowed to use the attic and kitchen. Marchpane lay in their big bed, bathed in their bath, sat on their chairs, ate and drank out of their flowered china, looked out of their windows. And Apple was still Apple in the house. He would not stay in the kitchen, not because, like Birdie, he could not remember, but because he didn't want to stay in the kitchen. He was not afraid of Marchpane, and he liked everybody as everybody liked him. "Sing me a song," he said to Marchpane. "I don't know any songs," said Marchpane. She knew that the Plantagenets did not like Apple to be with her, and so she said, "You sing to me." And Apple began to sing to Marchpane. Every day he sang her a song, and she pretended to love it. Soon he had a habit of going into Marchpane. "Apple, don't do that," said Tottie. "Will," said Apple. "Don't," said Tottie. "Do," said Marchpane. Apple liked people who said do better than people who said don't, and he continued to go into Marchpane. "She will get him into mischief," said Tottie. "I'm very uneasy about him," said Mr. Plantagenet, but they were far too proud to go in after Apple and show Marchpane that they cared. Birdie was not too proud. She went straight in and brought Apple back. That surprised them. "And why don't you let him play with me?" asked Marchpane. Birdie could not answer. As soon as Marchpane spoke to her, she became confused. But Tottie answered her. "Because we do not choose," said Tottie. "You do not choose." "You let him do dangerous things," said Birdie suddenly. "Do I?" said Marchpane, and smiled. "Yes, I do," she said, "if I want." "You had better not," said Tottie. "He is our little boy." "Is he? Fancy that," said Marchpane. Suddenly, just after that, Emily said to Charlotte, "I know, Apple shall be her little boy." "Whose little boy?" "Marchpane's." "But he isn't Marchpane's little boy. He's a Plantagenet. You can't change him now." In the doll's house there was silence. Marchpane, Birdie, Mr. Plantagenet, Tottie, and Dana had all heard. Tottie was wishing desperately. "Oh, Emily, Emily, I wish, wished Tottie." But Marchpane only smiled her heavy china smile. If it were impossible for Birdie to remember that her room was Marchpane's, how could she remember that Apple was now Marchpane's little boy? She forgot all the time, and this, of course, gave Marchpane many opportunities to pounce on her, and Marchpane loved pouncing on Birdie. "Birdie," urged Tottie, "try and remember not to go in after Apple. We must give him up for the present, just for the present," said Tottie firmly. "We shall get him back," said Tottie. It happened that Mrs. Innisfree gave Emily and Charlotte a musical box. It played music that was the smallest tinkle, delicate and thin. Emily had put it in the doll's house sitting room for Marchpane and Apple to hear, and the sound of it filled the house. Tinkle, tinkle, played the music box. It drew Birdie from the kitchen. "What is it? What is it?" asked Birdie. "Oh, how beautiful it is!" It drew her from the kitchen across the hall to the closed sitting-room door. Now, as she stood at the sitting-room door, the tinkling of the musical box delighted her so much that it tinkled in her head, and she could no longer remember what anyone had said. She had no idea of going in, nor of anything else but the music, when suddenly she heard a sound that upset the running of the tinkling and spoiled it. "Oh, hush," Birdie said. "Don't, don't!" But it came again. Suddenly, Birdie, as if she had woken up, knew clearly what it was. It was Dana barking. "Arrrrrr!" came the sound. "Arrrrrr!" Clearly, in that instant, Birdie had one thought, and only one. "That was Dana," thought Birdie clearly. "Dana barking. Something is happening to Apple. Apple is in danger," thought Birdie, and she opened the sitting-room door. Apple was standing on one of the tapestry chairs, which was dragged up near the table, and he was leaning over the lamp with his darning wool wig near the candle flame. There was a strong smell of singeing, and it was just going to send the whole of Apple up in flames. Marchpane was sitting on the couch, watching him and smiling her china smile. Tinkle, tinkle went the music box. "Arrrrrr!" barked Dana. "Arrrrrr!" He barked frantically. "Isn't that Dana?" asked Tottie in the kitchen. "It's Dana!" cried Mr. Plantagenet, and he dropped his newspaper. "Emily, something is happening in the doll's house. I smell singeing," said Charlotte, sniffing. "Emily, did you light the birthday candle?" "Dana, tinkle, fluttered Birdie, while Marchpane smiled. "What am I to do?" cried Birdie. "Which is it? Is it which?" "Arrrrrr!" barked Dana. As the candle caught the edge of Apple's fringe and he screamed, as Tottie and Mr. Plantagenet tumbled in at the door and Emily and Charlotte swung open the doll's house front, the sound of Apple's scream tore the sound of Dana's barking and the tinkling music out of Birdie's head. She had one thought, and she threw herself at the lamp. "Birdie, back, back, back!" cried Mr. Plantagenet. "Birdie, let me!" screamed Tottie. "Birdie, you're made of celluloid, remember!" "Celluloid," said Birdie in her light, calm voice, and the lightness of the real candle was in her face. Light as she was, she threw herself between Apple and the lamp, and Apple fell off the chair, face downward on the carpet, and put out the spark of fire in his wig. There was a flash, a bright light, a white flame, and where Birdie had been there was no more Birdie, no sign of Birdie at all. Only sinking gradually down on the carpet beside Apple floated Birdie's clothes, burning, slowly turning brown and going into holes. Last of all, the fire ran up the pink embroidery cotton of her apron strings, and they waved up in the air as they used to wave on Birdie, and then were burnt right up. "Tinkle, tinkle, tinkle," said the music box. Marchpane smiled. "But where did Birdie go?" asked Charlotte. "She was celluloid. That is highly inflammable," said Father. "What is highly inflammable?" "It burns up in a flash, leaving nothing behind." "Birdie left nothing behind," said Charlotte sadly. "Apple was standing on the chair far too near the lamp. You must have put him there, Charlotte," said Emily. "I didn't," said Charlotte. "Don't be silly, Charlotte," said Emily. "And his wig must have caught fire. That was why we smelled singeing." "Birdie gave her life for Apple," said Charlotte. "What a good thing it was only Birdie," said Emily, but she didn't say it very certainly. "Tottie tumbled in at the door," said Charlotte, "and Mr. Plantagenet did too. I put them in the kitchen. I didn't put them in the doorway, although you say I did." "The only one who never moved," said Charlotte loudly, "was Marchpane." "Yes, Marchpane," said Emily slowly. "I should like to take her up by a pair of tongs," said Charlotte, "and drop her in the fire." "Oh, Charlotte, she's far too beautiful." "She isn't beautiful at all," said Charlotte. "She's nasty, and she smells nasty too." A thought struck her. "Emily," she said, "wasn't Birdie beautiful when she went up in that flame? Like a fairy, like a beautiful kind of silver firework." "Birdie would have liked that," said Emily, and she sounded like the old Emily, who knew so well what all the Plantagenets liked. "Oh, Charlotte." "Yes, Emily." "Suddenly," said Emily, "I don't like Marchpane very much. She must go out of the doll's house. She must go out at once." "I know," said Charlotte. "We must give her to a museum." Marchpane enjoyed being in the museum. She was in a glass case between a lace collar and a china model of a King Charles spaniel. She was dusted very carefully twice a week, and a number of people came to look at her. Every day she increased a little more in conceit, and the glass case made her safe from ever being played with. Towards 6 o'clock, just after tea, Charlotte brought Mr. Plantagenet back from the post office and put him in his chair in the sitting room and gave him his paper. Emily brought Tottie in from shopping. Then she went in to sit with Mr. Plantagenet. Apple was safely in bed, tucked up in his patchwork quilt so that only his round head showed, and Dana lay quietly, snugly in his kennel. "Shall we let them have a little music?" asked Emily, and she wound up the musical box. It went tinkle, tinkle, and Dana stirred in his dreams. "Things come and things pass," said little Mr. Plantagenet, "even for dolls. Good things and bad things. But the good things have come back, haven't they, Tottie?" asked Mr. Plantagenet anxiously. "Of course they have," said Tottie in her kind wooden voice. "So let's be happy now." "Without Birdie?" asked Mr. Plantagenet, his voice trembling. "Birdie would be happy. She couldn't help it," said Tottie. And Birdie's bright tinkling music went on in the doll's house, and on her hat that still hung in the hall, and on her feather broom, and on her bird, and on her parasol, the colours and the patterns were still bright.